we just finished our virtual Infiom Salon where Mark Blinder was the is the CEO from Icon, and have a bunch of questions for him. So I'm going to start with him. Um, we were discussing some really interesting points about NFTs, DeFi spaces, and consensus blockchain. So, Mark, your presentation was just amazing. It really went through the history of DeFi, which kind of happened in a year, and where it's going long term. Um, what do you think would be some of the first applications other than the tokenized, crowdfunding that you talked about, which I thought was amazing? What are some other applications that you're seeing?
Yeah, well, we have seen and are working with a company that's doing tokenization of gold, right? Like tokens linked to physical gold. A lot of folks have tried that, but the company we're working with is a holder of quite major gold reserves already, and so that idea that you could be trading gold in this like highly I guess, accountable and believable way, but with high liquidity is, I think, naturally very appealing. And I think they've got a very good shot at doing it. I think the decentralized exchanges are just a perfect use case because um, you don't have to worry about things like double spend or margin calls that can't be fulfilled, that type of thing. And so I think and also you sort of take away some of the incentives for high frequency and put much more incentive on uh, picking things that have value. I think personally, but that's people might argue with that.
Mark, I think that one issue that I have with asset tokenization in general is the whole concept of proof of existence. Right? There's a token out there, and it's a proxy for a real world asset. But how do I know it's there? How do I know it's the right quality? How do I know that that the set of rules that apply in a particular jurisdiction apply to me as a token holder, right? And in a lot of cases, the answer is, well, they don't. I mean, Liechtenstein may support the concept that if you create a company and issue shares, that you can tokenize those shares and you can go to court with your little phone and show your balance, and the court will say, okay, but but you have to go to Liechtenstein. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are to solve this problem, which is essentially a centralization problem.
Yeah, well, I think it's first of all, that is a great point, and it's part of why I am in the medium term more bullish on DeFi than NFTs. Because I think a lot of the problem in long run I am bullish on both, but I think a lot of the problem with short kind of medium term is exactly what you're saying, the linking of the online and offline, right? I could take the example of an expensive bottle of wine. Like I could drink the wine, put some cheaper wine in the bottle, sell you the NFT. How would you ever know, right? And likewise, even with a piece of art, right? I give you a fake copy of the piece of art, and you may have the NFT, but you know there's a lot to that. And so I do think the most potent use cases right now are things that are all digital, right? Like digital content. That's what we see is very successful so far with NFTs, or digital financial instruments, right? Like this one with that we did with Republic, the note token. It pays dividends based on the on-chain holding of the token. And so if you're holding the token, when the dividends go out, you get USDC deposited in the wallet that has the tokens. And so that's the type of thing where even if you like over time, you can see the proof that stuff is being paid, people are getting their outcomes that are expected without having to necessarily enforce it with a lawsuit. But I think you're dead on with one of the biggest issues in the blockchain is that it is so isolated from the rest of the world. And it's part of why I think it is valuable to have these sort of bridges, whether it's this like kind of trustworthy holder of a lot of gold who has insurance, who's audited, who has a company you can sue, or a tokenized equity where the activity takes place on chain, and so the proof is in the pudding. You don't have to kind of trust this online offline connection.
Yeah, I mean, I think even to extend to your concept of dividing what are like real tangible assets or real world assets and then sort of digital assets. Even in the digital asset space, the NFT technology really fails, right? Because you can take a painting and take a really high resolution photograph of it and destroy the painting. Okay, so now you have a purely digital asset, but you take this image and maybe well, you just take this image and you stick it into IPFS, and you've got a hash, and you can embed that hash in the NFT. Okay, that's great, but anyone who's got anyone who's got the hash can go get the picture. So that picture isn't like a Bitcoin, that it isn't irreproducible, right?
Yeah.
So there you fail because okay, I own this NFT, but there are now 10,000 pictures, copies of my picture that I'm supposed to own, right? And I'll take that even a step further. Supposing that you have an asset that is actually unreplicatable, like Bitcoin. So I own this Bitcoin, and no one else can have the Bitcoin because the Bitcoin protocol will enforce that. Great. Can I create an NFT for my Bitcoin, right? And even there we fail because the problem is that we're now basically trying to create a proxy item for a different blockchain. They've done this on Ethereum for the sake of trading Bitcoin over a decentralized exchange, right? But you see the solution. Wrap Bitcoin is a centralized solution, right? You have to actually surrender your bits to some human being or set of human beings who then you're right back into the same problem. They run off with your stuff, right? And so that just doesn't work.
Well, I mean, I think it depends on how you define ownership a little bit, right? So when you talk about like that digital image or that piece of art, um, it's true that anyone can bootleg a piece of art like that fairly easily, but the value, I mean, frankly, like there are a million placemats in the world with the Mona Lisa on them, right? And you can, I'm sure, for not that much money, get a actually super realistic reproduction of the Mona Lisa. And so I think that's just a almost philosophical question about what it is to be like true art and like what it is to own that piece of art, right? It's like, I mean, Andy Warhol would like do silk screens and run off multiple copies of the same thing, right? And so like those, anyone could then recopy that thing and have a picture of a can of Campbell soup, but the like question of authenticity is more, I think, in the eye of society and how other people value it. And so I don't think the fact that anyone can screenshot this image is that different than the fact that anyone could, use a high res Xerox machine to make a copy of a picture of a can of Campbell soup from Warhol.
So I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I think that we have created a technology that significantly improves the way in which we can do things. That is to say, Nakamoto went and created a means by which he can guarantee that if I own a Bitcoin, that Bitcoin is actually mine, right? No copies are allowed of that Bitcoin. And the real challenge here is, can we extend that paradigm to other digital assets like your picture? Because if the reality is that I bought this NFT and it's supposed to represent this picture, and that picture is copyable, if anyone can just go and make as many copies, then we haven't solved anything, right? We haven't improved the world in any way, because that's exactly what happens today. And so, so the real question is, we're so close, right? Bitcoin solved the problem. It solved it for Bitcoin, okay, or for tokens. Can we extend that to the rest of the assets? And if we can, then that makes for a brand new world. That's my point.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. There's like some big unsolved questions there, right? And I think the use cases 5 years from now are probably going to be different than the ones today. Like, people are trying to do the most clear cut or obvious or easiest to achieve things first, but it may be that there are more important uses that, like, for example, it seems to me that a better use of an NFT for a piece of content, to your point, right? Anyone can copy the content, right? Like, you can bootleg this image. And so to me, the thing that would give the NFT real value is if it had the legal right to license that content, right? So that if I
But
have
you've
the
lost the
NFT
game
of a
right there.
movie,
Right, you've already lost the game, right? For that matter, then just because we already have a body of law to rely on, which doesn't work with, doesn't work at all. And so what you're saying is we're going to go back and rely on that when we potentially have mechanisms that can actually work, like a smart contract works, right? We just haven't figured out how to make it touch real things.
yeah. And I guess, I mean, to me, I just think it's more likely to happen where the value of the smart contract based technology is recognized by the players of the industry as being a neutral and fair arbiter between them, and so then they adopt it. But yeah, like, I don't think there's code wise something that needs to be done there as much as there's kind of like social slash legal slash adoption problems to make that happen. Personally, I mean, that it's pure conjecture, but that's kind of my thought on like that kind of content space.
And
But
I
you
want to bring
understand
it.
that this isn't about adoption, right? It's about mechanism. We don't have the mechanisms. I mean, adoption is if you have the mechanism, it can be adopted. But we don't have the mechanisms right now.
Well, and that's, well, I guess I would argue the opposite side by saying, so like, we have today already a um like an NFT for this piece of Beeple art, right? This very famous piece of art. If museums decide that they will only display this digital art according to the will of the one person who owns that NFT, then the mechanism is there, right? But it depends on the consensus in the real world about whether museums will display fake versions, which are easy to make and can be done, or whether they will collectively adopt a sort of standard that you only display the ones for which you have the permission of the current holder, right? Because the only thing Ethereum gives you in this mix right now is the provable uniqueness of the one holder at any given time. And so you have an authority you could go to say, well, if my museum wants to show this piece of art, here's the current owner that I have to get permission from. Or you can have a more anarchic system where you just circumvent that. But to me, that's about real world consensus and kind of how museums adopt this new technology, just to take this one specific example.
Yeah, that's an off-chain process, right? And that's kind of the point that I'm saying is that we need to figure out how to bring real life stuff on chain, because on the chain, if I have a smart contract that distributes money in a particular way, if I want to make it do something else, where I is some government or some guy who's trying to cheat, or whatever, right, or just someone with influence, the answer is no. Right now, in the real world, if you're going to revert back to consensus, to off-chain consensus mechanisms where people have to comply, then, well, that's where we are, and therefore we haven't really improved the world at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's, to me, this is like a well, this is one of the things I like most about being in the blockchain industry, right? Is it touches on politics, economics, and technology, right? Because I think the stance you're coming from, if I'm understanding you correctly, is very much like through the lens of technology, right? And like that this isn't solved in a computer science way.
Yeah, I
But
mean, it's a question of trust, right? Bitcoin is a trust machine. And it's a trust machine because I can trust it, because it's a piece of code. Human beings, you cannot trust them, ever. right? They lie, they cheat, they do everything, they game the system, and so this is really the place where I'm coming from is how do we take more of the behavior that is currently offline on or off chain on chain, and so having proxies where you have an off-chain proof of existence mechanism is simply not workable, right? I mean, it's it's almost
Well, I mean,
unimportant
to me,
whether anyone adopts it because it's not a solution.
well, I guess I kind of disagree with that premise. And apologies, like if we need to get off this topic for everyone else, let me know. I find this stuff super interesting, but I disagree a little bit with the premise because if it's working, then it's a workable solution, right? Like Bitcoin proves the uniqueness of Bitcoin. It's only the fact that people are willing to pay $50,000 for one Bitcoin that makes you able to buy a house with it. And so it to me it's not a flaw in Bitcoin that it doesn't currently plug into real estate title systems. It's just a process of adoption that's happening societally that only can be accomplished with time. There is no piece of code in my eye that fixes that. There's only time because you've solved the trust issue, but now people need to adopt this trusted database or record or whatever.
So I want to go back to Christian. I think that's a very interesting discussion. Christian, you were talking about, the identity, the credit score, almost these things that go with you as a human being, attached to you, on the blockchain as you travel through. Are you seeing what Tim Draper talks about? The fact that countries at some point will actually vie for your citizenship versus the other way around?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm seeing that. I would like to see it, which is different from expecting to see it. But maybe to piggyback on what the speaker said earlier, it's always a very unfortunate term to introduce the term trust into a technology discussion, because really the paradigm here is that of evil and not being evil, and the point there being as Bitcoin can't be evil. It's about developing technology that cannot be evil, right? So you don't have to have trust. That's the real point. The other point is that's was what I was mentioning earlier in our talk, is you have to divide between things that are digitally native and things that you're onboarding to a decentralized software solution. And there it's actually mostly graph-based solution or blockchain solution. Blockchain, you build digital vending machines with, and graph-based solutions, you anchor cryptographic primitives to a graph and map them on a graph, because you actually do not want copies of asset information. You do not want copies of PII on a blockchain. So that's a very misguided way of thinking about the new network topology. And so in terms of PII, that's the one single thing that we need to address right now, right? So we are feverishly working towards viable solutions that do not store your biometric data and your health data in a database or on a blockchain for that matter. These should be cryptographic primitives under your control at all times. And the typical metaphor I use for that is your passport. Right, so if this was before the invention of databases, before 1960, and you had your passport, you would show it to a passport agent at your border. He would inspect it, maybe go through some paperwork, return it back to you. The point here being is this is the type of digital cryptographic primitives we need to build, these kind of digital barrier instrument that prove certain things about an individual, but there aren't any copies around. They need to be under your control, and you run it maybe against some Oracle function to prove certain things, but they are all separate, right? They just prove I'm of a certain age that fits within the parameters of whatever action is required. And this is probably way too high level, but I'm happy to make 1,010 examples that I want to see in the world that we want to invest in for these solutions. And there specifically, I want to see a lot more solutions where people actually actively go after violations of that current state. What I mean by that is there's anywhere between 4,000 to 5,000 data brokers. Most of the you have never heard of, right? We know of the obvious ones, the Facebooks and Googles of the world, who offer the social engineering as a service implementations to use that data. But it's really the data brokers in the background who are doing evil. And there specifically, what I want to see in the world is that we eradicate those parasites from the network, right? We have to do this. We have to clean up this digital landfill that we call the World Wide Web today to start from a clear slate to actually have a viable network topology. Current network topology treats every user as an oracle function, something that spews out data that the network collects and reacts on, right? And that's the reversal. So that's why the largest battle cry that I've been trying to get through to regulators is you're entirely naive to ask for things such as the right to be forgotten. There is nothing to forget once it's being digitally recorded. That's just a naive assumption. The right here is the right not to be observed. That's what we need to ask for, and these are the technologies that we need to build. I make one last example, and then I'm happy to answer questions. But right now, the current paradigm of what people call KYC, which is just this window dressing term within this anti-money laundering regulation, what it's actually doing is it's violating people's rights on a daily basis. What I mean by that is it's a dragnet approach, right? You're already being asked to divulge personal identifiable data at the second that you open up an account. You haven't actually moved any money. So if and when and where people actually implement digital barrier instrument solutions that attach PII only in instances where there's an actual legal requirement because there is either a nefarious good involved or a nefarious actor involved, and in these cases you have to attach it and or prevent the transaction, then you do this. But if you also have the technology to only do this when that's required, guess what? All other implementation, all database solutions that do this legacy dragnet approach will become unconstitutional and illegal. And they should have been all along, by the way, right?
So
Anyway,
the fact that that I think that's really a great kind of coordinate system to look at what's going on. When I first entered this space back in like maybe 2015, 2016, um, there were not that many players in it, and certainly there were not that many tokens in it. And I would say in the first ICO boom in 2017, we saw a few thousand companies being launched, some with tokens, some without. Regulators came in, and whole host of different regulations kind of stifled the growth in a variety of areas. But then the DeFi happened that Mark was talking about last year, and now I get notifications when new tokens are being minted on Uniswap. My phone is constantly being, zapped by these tokens. So even there's about a 9,000 listed ones, we're probably going to have, 30, 40, 50,000 new
no,
ones.
no,
So what do
no,
you
I
think
doubt.
is going to happen?
No, I doubt it. So the point that being, what is a token? Right. So token is the peer-to-peer bearer instrument of a public blockchain. So that's all that is. It's a technical function first and foremost, including Ether's original function. So everything else that you bolt on top of it, specifically if when where you're creating a new unit of account, is actually friction. So it's middleware in and of itself. And there's an easy way to understand this. Everybody who's looking at the digital wallet right now, what do you see? You see the translation of your Bitcoin holdings in US dollar or whatever your unit of account and your language of value is. Same if you're in Europe, you see the translation in euros. This is true for every cryptocurrency. And this is also, from a technology perspective, the largest friction you could ever introduce, introducing a new language of value. So the point there being is those things need to be implemented as technologies. So that's why this whole battle cry, I get an email at least once a day, is still, after all these years, with things like cryptocurrency adoption, blockchain adoption. That is just misguided. That's not thinking the stack through. It's about not about cryptocurrency adoption, not about blockchain adoption. It's about adapting the technologies to the users. People did not adopt voice of IP. They adopted Skype, they adopted WhatsApp, and so forth. So the point there being is the best technology is those that you do not even notice as there. And so right now, and I love technologists. I'm a technologist myself. Love them to death, and they have all great intentions, but they live in their own ecosystem. DeFi for 99% of the applications right now is entirely insulated from the real world. All the value is in the on and off ramps, right? So that's why this old adage of the fat protocol theory is utterly wrong, obviously. So you don't accrue value to the SMTP protocol. You don't accrue value to the voice of IP protocol. You accrue value to the applications on top of that. So it's actually the reverse. The top level, that's where all the value is going to be aggregated. It's not on the quote unquote protocol level, not that these things are actual protocols.
So out of the 9,000 tokens, which are 97, 98% protocols, you believe most of those really have no value?
Um, Again, so you got to split. Value is one is belief, and the other one part belief, one part utility, right? So we are technology investors. We're looking mostly at the utility. And I'm a believer, quote unquote, in Bitcoin, right? It's just not something that you can invest in as a technology per se. Does that make sense? So whatever the market price is mostly belief driven. It's mostly um, driven by people believing the price is going up and so forth. And that's interesting to some extent, but the more interesting, the more urgent part is really to fix the network topology. Because the externalities of current network topology is what we're suffering from. It's not the lack of having yet another name for yet another Yababuki coin, right? No one needs that. The number of cryptocurrencies we need is probably somewhere between 0 and 1, right, from a technology perspective. And again, we invested in MMORPGs since 2000, so we like all those. But if you want to actually transform economic activity at scale, you simply have to take a snapshot on how that's being done today. And then you need to onboard those processes to decentralized software applications, which is the term that I use for blockchains and graphs. And again, blockchains are building blocks for the digital vending machines living on decentralized software solution, living on graphs. You should never create copies. You should never create copies of PII. You should never create copies of PII, regardless if that's anchored to a blockchain, right? That's not the right technology for it. And you see this on a daily basis. Let's ignore the fact that there's 10 to 20% of bitcoins lost by people just simply losing their private keys. But this is just not a practical implementation, because then this is more of the same, more of what we have right now, more database solutions, right? More copies of things. That's not the point.
So, in terms of, yeah, I hear you. I agree with you quite a bit on that. I feel that there is no space for thousands of native chains. But why are they being built? Do you think some of them will convert to some of the applications you're talking about? Or are they going to go for it and try to, uh, beat Binance and beat Ethereum at their game, kind of a thing?
Well, experiments are great, and that's the thing. I mean, for the first time, we have the actual ability to do experiments on financial rails. So there is this explosion of experiments out there, and obviously, it's very tempting to create your own currency if that's pretty easy to do. Um, that's the obvious part. But at the end of the day, how many do you need, right? How many do you really need? And what are the current use cases of money? You can really dumb it down to two use cases, right? So the main use case of fiat in the real world is lending. and it's typically asset-backed lending, so the home mortgages, etc. And the huge advantage that the legacy financial systems have, specifically commercial banks, they get to create that money. This is money from nothing. Right? This is new money supply. And the primary inflation, because of that, is happening primarily to that asset class. So that's why 99% of the discussions that are being had around these topics are just utterly vacuous, because they're not actually talking about the observable externalities of these type of implementations. And so we have to start talking about these and actually bringing these to the forefront while we are creating new technologies, because the larger point here is, so we outlined an actual viable implementation of a first batch for CBDC, for a central-based digital currency, right? Because right now there is some AD design proposals, and they're all focusing on payments. Payments is solved. The velocity of M1 right now is already, in theory, the speed of light, right? 97% of all value entries are just bytes in databases. So the only difference is that they're bytes that are anchored to databases under control by financial service providers that are also hampered by some other regulatory and technical debt. So, and the point here being is, once you realize that, then you also realize that since the velocity of M1, so payment functions, is in theory and has always been since the invention of databases the speed of light, which is how fast bytes can move on a network in theory. So then you'll also see that at some point in time in the hopeful near future, M1, so what the Federal Reserve just stopped tracking, should actually not exist at rest at all. So when we first started our last fund, we looked at a lot of payment solutions. And so we take a 5-10 year horizon for our investments. And the thesis that we came up with is there is no alpha in payment, right? Payment should be free, just like sending an email, right? So that there's still fees attached today is like putting a stamp on an email, essentially. And so we're making the assumption that in 5 to 10 years from now, at least in developed nations, or maybe more in the developing nations, payments will simply be a free thing, just like sending emails. Lending, obviously, will still be around. So you have to focus on how is lending done today and how can you attack lending. Right now, within the DeFi system, it's usually collateralized lending with digitally native assets. That will only go so far, right? Because comes back to Gresham's law. At some point in time, if my option is I have something that's backed by a real world asset, like a house or something, what am I going to choose? The answer for most people is pretty clear cut. I'm not talking about people within our space, but the rest of the world, right, that we need to include. Stopping my sermon here.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think you pointed out um, to the fact that there's just a lot of a lot of interesting stuff going on in the space, but not in a way that you would want to like to see the space develop, because the technology is very important and it's applicable to many different use cases in real life. But the way that the space developed, because Bitcoin as the cryptocurrency was the first, use case, everybody created their own version. And so I'm not sure what's going to happen in the next few years as we shift from that view of the world to the world that's actually going to solve consumer problems and enterprise problems.
Well, we still don't have peer-to-peer cash for one, right? That's what Bitcoin was trying to achieve. Obviously, it can never do that. Well,
I think Elon Musk is going to get us much closer to that goal, though, if you think about the fact that he can take all this excess solar power and basically mine Bitcoin. That should drive the cost of transactions down substantially, because now you don't need to have these huge capital costs, upfront capital costs for the equipment, and you really decentralize the competition. So at some point, I believe his recent announcement will make Bitcoin a utility, and we will get to where you're driving, which is payments should be free.
right.
At least that seems to me that way.
Sure, but I mean, Bitcoin, based on its monetary policy, can never be a function for payment, right? It's limited in supply, so the price will presumably always go up.
There's no objection with that. You can still use it for payment, right? I mean,
Oh yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
that's an
If you're in
Austrian
El
economics
Salvador, yeah,
argument.
yeah, yeah, yeah. If you're in El Salvador, is a great payment mechanism. I'm just saying for China, for the United States, for Germany, for the United Kingdom, there's no utility for Bitcoin in payments, right?
For
Well,
international settlements, you mean?
well, again, all the values in the on and off ramps. It really depends on the use case. So, and that's why it never makes sense to talk about these things in generalities. And so, the one example there is look at the current stablecoin landscape, right? So, what's Tether's use case? Tether's use case is for people to stay on centralized exchanges and mostly exchange Tether against Bitcoin. That's the use case. You can observe that, right? So you can readily see that. And so that's my point. What I was making earlier. You simply have to observe the current technology and then see what technology does. What are the use cases? And so that's why people typically conflate and confuse functions and use cases. So to make a very simple example, the function of a hammer, for example, as a technology is to centralize centrifugal force. But then the use cases could be something like driving a nail into the wall, or I can hit someone over the head with it, which is not the intended use case. So the point there being is that the function of money today is simply limited to the unit of account as the language of value that everybody understands. Hence, the translation in your digital wallet to the unit of account and language of value that you understand. That's the remaining function. And so, whatever the other party wants, that should happen literally simultaneously within the context of the app. If you're familiar with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I've been using this barbelfish in my presentations on Bitcoin for the past 8 years, because that's exactly what we need. We need to just show the value that you want to see on your end the way you want to see it. So whatever intermediary you want to use doesn't matter at all, because the default medium of exchange has been bytes for decades. It doesn't matter if you're moving a dollar or Bitcoin, right? The default medium of exchange is the same. It's just bytes. And what color my byte has, I don't really care. I care that the value that I see in my digital wallet, that I understand that particular value. That's all there is.
So if we just theorizing, if we said that Bitcoin had upward scalability, and eventually the price flattens out as it eats up all of the fiat in the world, would you still make the argument that it's not a real payment rail?
It's not a real payment rail. Again, it's the individual use case. The only way this could work is if the US dollar fails. Then it could be a payment rail. The reason being is,
Right, that's my point.
so if the US dollar fails, then Bitcoin might become a payment rail, but it's more likely it's something else, like an Algorand.
But euros are a real payment rail, right? And the dollar still exists, so Bitcoin can just be another currency.
No, it's a little different. So the point there being is, what is Bitcoin as a technology is just like everything else. It's a network technology, and what's part of the network? It's the human. The humans are the nodes, the main nodes in the network. There's always this confusion about calling the technology the nodes. The humans are the node that make up the network, right? That's the network effect. And so the currency with the largest network effect is the US dollar today. And even if you look at something like the physical versions of the US dollar, like a Federal Reserve note, it's more censorship resistant than Bitcoin, quite obviously. When they raided Saddam Hussein's palace, they found 600 million printed Federal Reserve notes in his palace, because this is the most censorship resistant form of currency we have today. Bitcoin is not censorship resistant whatsoever. There's enormous list of blacklisted addresses out there.
It's also not proof. It's also not counterfeit proof, right? Which is a different problem and one that Bitcoin solves.
Countership proof, okay.
Counterfeit, because you have a paper dollar, but how do you know that that was actually printed by the Fed? Right? At some point, it actually doesn't matter. But
exactly,
the point is that monetary inflation robs your purchasing power, and that again is something that Bitcoin solves.
Yes and no, because again, so that there's a huge confusion about what inflation is, right? Inflation could be good for you. You don't know it. Something that's circumstantial. Most inflation is happening to assets. That doesn't happen to the by increasing the base money supply. That's a second order effect, right? It's inflating the cost of housing. It's inflating the cost of education and so forth. But the larger picture here is simply look at money as a network technology. What has the largest network effect? The largest network effect of today is the US dollar. And that's why you can go back in history and just see when a local currency failed, what did people do? People bought the physical version of the US dollar. And that's true in Argentina today. That's more used than Bitcoin. The physical printed version of the US dollar is used there.
It's interesting with Argentina, and I think Venezuela as well. We had Omar here. He's not here any longer with us, but he's with Dash, digital cash currency. They were
Yeah,
very successful in these countries in
sure.
terms of replacing the inflated currency by just their app. So people would wait for hours in line to buy food in Venezuela, but with the Dash app, it takes like 5 minutes. So there is, I would say, an inherent liquidity that's attached to some of these technological developments that allow the currency to be valuable to consumers.
Yeah,
But I'd like to go back to the point about inflation. Let me be more precise. Currency devaluation, right, or purchasing power loss, because to some extent the two concepts can be conflated, right? But the use case here is for Bitcoin is that across time you don't lose your purchasing power, and that is actually a compelling reason
sure.
to expand the network, right? The
Yeah,
network will grow because it's actually competitive against something like the dollar, as well
yeah.
as not being counterfeited.
Yeah, well, you're referring to just one use case, right? The store of value function. But then again, as a store of value function, it's always part of a basket. So if you were in one of those countries that you mentioned, yes, I would totally suggest that you increase the part of your basket that is Bitcoin. If you're in the United States, I wouldn't suggest you do more than 1 to 10%, depending on what your situation is, right?
You're not suggesting that the dollar hasn't lost like 98% of its
Oh no,
value in the last
totally.
30
No, no,
years or
no. I
40
don't
years,
keep
right?
cash around. That's not the point. But I also don't plow everything in Bitcoin. That would be gross negligent, right?
You're just saying that there are other investments in the U.S. market that one can get access to that are also appreciating.
Right. So a store of value is always a basket, right? I would not suggest that anybody just bets on one thing. So, so that what we are really talking about, what should, in your particular scenario, the percentage of your basket be that's comprised of Bitcoin or something else or some other cryptocurrency? If you want to give like very, very simplified investment advice for people in the developed nations, you would say, well, it's probably a good bet to put 5% of your net worth in Bitcoin and 5% in Ether, right? That's kind of an okay investment advice. Would I say you should put 50 and 50% in? No, I wouldn't. But again, it's very different if you're in India or some other country where the currency is not as quote unquote stable. Again, I don't subscribe to the official numbers on inflation here either, but actually that's not the point. So to talk about inflation in general terms, it's valueless, right? It's absolutely vacuous because it depends on the individual. It depends on time and space, and so all those reports that comparing these don't make sense unless you're just comparing currency to currency, and then if and where and when you could swap those, yes, you should totally do that, right? But for most people, just from matter of practicality, again, they have to buy bread, they have to survive, and so they will swap in whatever the counterparty will accept as form of payment. That's why a long time ago I wrote this very simplified example of three people looking at a house. You might think the house is worth $1 million or 100 million pesos or 900,000 euros. The house is still the same house. It's just your personal language of value that only exists in your head as long as you're not talking to the seller. And if you're talking to the seller and the house is in Kyrgyzstan and he wants some monies, well, then you have to first agree on the common language of value. That it's simply a legal agreement. And after you agree on a common language of value, you agree on a medium of exchange, which is yet another legal agreement. So it's just a matter that people understand how to separate all these different agreements in technologies, right? And that simply is an individual choice that you need to make available as a technologist to the user. There's no value making general assumptions about that, right? And all these technologies are being built. They're just being built with kind of this myopic view towards digitally native assets, when the more important thing is actually onboarding legacy things. And it could be something as simple as making NFTs out of documents and creating standards for those, right?
Yeah, we're working with a company that does just that. That we just started working with them this month. There's legal agreements on the in a smart contract, and so if you can create an NFT today that just says here's my payment, here's my royalty payment, and it's kind of limited in terms of the actual underlying contract, this company can add a full-fledged contract of of any kind to the to the smart contracts. And I think that's an interim solution, but at least it's a solution to kind of create these more interesting NFTs.
Okay, we don't have to go down the rabbit hole, but one high level question: how they solve agency and attribution on the identity level?
Yeah, so the identity has not been solved. I
Okay,
agree
so
because it's as good
that's
as
step one.
people. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I'm with you.
I've seen this at least, I don't know, a couple hundred times by now. That is step one. This is like creating a virtual world without creating your avatar first. So you're creating a lot of virtual items that no one will be able to pick up. That's in very simple terms what people keep doing on a daily basis. You need to understand the architecture that you need for that, right? So it's a key lock system. So and you're the key. You need to create those slots first. It's infuriating how many people spend their time spinning new cryptocurrencies, etc., when the obvious things to do and that they're urgently to do are clearly observable right now.
So if the identity system that you think will be the final solution, what does that look like?
So I'm working with three different groups right now: the Ethereum Foundation, the Open Identity Foundation, and the Open Travel Association. So what we're going to do is we append the existing data exchange standards that already exist for travel with qualities around biometrics and health. And my largest efforts there is to make sure that these will be stored as cryptographic primitives mapped to graph-based solutions.
Would be a
Well, and that's
standard,
something
right?
that I think one of the things we're doing in the identity space is trying to make use of the secure enclave on people's devices, right? Their
Mm-hmm.
smartphone or their
Mm-hmm.
laptop, because that's one of the few ways that is sort of very user friendly where you can kind of prove the personally identifiable information without having it stored on a database somewhere, to your previous point. And so I think that's a big piece of it, right?
Yes, albeit I mean I don't have the perfect architecture. We have an outline on GitHub that maps out the do's and don'ts. But essentially, what I do here is I keep a kill list and a list to invest in. So the kill list will entail everybody who is doubling down on current on legacy user name, password, account systems like the database implementations. They go into our kill list, and then we put privacy preserving and otherwise decentralized architectures into the invest list. So right now we are still kind of on the outer edges. That's why we made investment in biometric solutions and basic building blocks for NFT creation and so forth, because everything else at this moment is really the cart before the horse, right? And a lot of kind of AOL like implementations where people kind of think they're on the internet, but they aren't, right? It's like Coinbase has nothing to do with blockchain, right? Coinbase is
Mm.
adjacent to the system. It's an off ramp, and for most people in our industry, in our ecosystem here, they think of it as the evil empire because they actually invalidate the herd immunity of the currencies that they're custodying, right? So at that point in time, that particular coin or token is actually kind of dead for its intended purpose, if you think about it, because at that point in time, once you start attaching one form of PII to it, you're invalidating the herd immunity. What I mean by that is at that point in time, you will be pretty much able to identify any transaction happening on that chain. And the problem there specifically is unless you make this inherent to the other underlying network topology, you can't avoid that. What I mean by that, even if you doing all the right things, if you whatever run a mixer and run your own VPN and so forth, but the other party doesn't do that, and he she gets a gun to their head, forcing him or her to divulge the counterparty, that's going to happen, right? So the only way to remedy this from a network topology perspective is to only use blockchains to actually create digital vending machines. And so the metaphor for that is Nick Szabo made that a long time ago, albeit he didn't map it out entirely because those primitives didn't exist when he wrote this. So the way you have to imagine that is think of it as a collection of smart contracts making up this digital vending machine. You approach that digital vending machine with the good or service you have to sell, and you deposit it there. So, and the digital vending machine will ask for whatever credentials are necessary to prove that you have the right to deposit this asset or right there. And the next person coming by will do the same and will just pick up what you left there with his, her credentials and otherwise verifications, identification, certifications that are needed for the transfer. But you have no idea who that is, and you shouldn't know that. So that is the only correct architecture, in which case you don't actually interact, obviously, peer-to-peer. This whole like metaphor of peer-to-peer is actually a little bit misguided in that sense.
Is that true of Binance as well? Everything is centralized.
Is what true? That they void the herd immunity? Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, there's just, it's kind of like a Coinbase
yeah,
similar.
of course.
Yeah,
Well, but they're also working. They're also working on a deck, so they have a deck live, I believe. But no,
but it's centralized, right?
but sure, yeah,
I don't get
they're
it.
It's
entirely
like,
decentralized, and there's no immutability with any transaction on the Binance chain either, for that matter.
yeah, and I think that's the interesting piece about this that comes down to the human factors, right? Because the question is, right, we can all sit here and say, well, the Binance Smart Chain is clearly under the control of Binance. It's in the
Right.
name. And like, will it be adopted by more people, or will the actually really better decentralized options be adopted by more people? Because that can become, those, as we've seen with Web 2.0, the monopolies can take over, right? And so that's the real question in the next 10 years is like, how does this thing evolve, and how can we make sure it evolves the right way as people who are in the industry?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot to be said for what Binance has done and been able to do from a centralized, kind of company perspective versus, playing in the same space as all the DAOs.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So DAOs long term, I think it's going to prove to be the most important paradigm that Bitcoin introduced, right? Because people always confuse blockchain and blockchain technology and think that the Bitcoin white paper introduced blockchain technology. It didn't, right? It's referenced in the second footnote. Bitcoin mainly introduced blockchain, and they are specifically decentralized software applications, and they are most importantly the DAOs. So another way of doing capital formation.
And I think for us, you're looking at it from
Yeah.
the business
Yeah.
perspective, the DAO is the most important concept because you're creating these economies where people are very vested in them.
Yeah.
And they own piece of the economy, they create value, and they benefit from the value. Yeah,
Okay,
that's kind of
guys.
hard to
Yeah,
connect. Yeah.
I have a hard stop in 2 minutes, but yeah, as you can tell, I'm semi-passionate about getting these topics right. I started writing a thesis around decentralization of the web 13 years ago. So for me, it can't happen quick enough. But it's infuriating just to see that a lot of people just waste their time on things that are clearly not within that required network topology. That is, unless you just started programming, is pretty obvious to detect.
It's interesting.
Anyway,
It's taken a lot of roads. Well, I want to thank everyone today from the virtual Infiom Salon, both from the presenting at the salon and presenting here in our um, clubhouse. And I want to thank all of our listeners. We will continue DAO discussion next time. We have these events every Wednesday from 1:30 to 2:30. If you want to join the club, you can follow me or follow the club and we'll let you in. And thanks, Mark and Jason and Eric, for all your wonderful comments for our 2 hour discussion. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. See you next
Thanks
time.
so much for having me. Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone, for listening.
that was great.
Thanks,
Thanks, you
guys.
guys.
Ciao.
Bye.